Hello, Chris and Tracy.
Hi.
Good afternoon. How are you both?
Good.
All right, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, fab. Right, thank you so much for your time today. So I absolutely adore this book, and I've said it a couple of times. I know to Tracy that I genuinely wish I had this book when I started teaching, just because there's so many touchstones in terms of how to think, how to respond to certain things. So if you're happy to, would you be happy to just share a bit about yourselves first, and then we go into the book chat?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So my name is Tracy Lees, and I think it's fair to say I've driven this more than you. You have been in some ways a reluctant passenger on this journey, but we've done it together. So we are brother and sister. I'm the older sister, in case you can't tell, because I imagine we look the same age on camera. And I'm an assistant head teacher, mother of two, very proud feminist. And it's something that runs very deeply through me, this idea of empowering, uplifting, celebrating women. So for me, Teach Like a Queen is like the hybrid child of lots of things that I'm really passionate about.
Yeah, I'm Chris Barker. I'm a maths teacher and head of department. And so in part of this journey, people ask me why are you contributing towards a book about feminism? And I think it's important that males are part of that discussion, because it can't, the injustice can't be corrected if there's not men as part of the dialogue. And I'm also passionate about, strong women and female role models and things like that. So hopefully still credible in the in the field.
Definitely. Thank you both. Definitely. Right. Well, we'll go straight into the first question then. So, your preface being that women in leadership generally only hold the power they are brave enough to request. However, when I read that, I found it a little bit problematic, because not all women feel brave enough to request that power, or feel that they are deserving or maybe should have that power. So, having written Teach Like a Queen, would you say that you're hoping it will be part of the solution, or that it is part of the solution?
I would really hope that it's part of the solution, because I think part of the solution is the acknowledgement of the problem of injustice. And for me, the women ed community, reading 10% Braver, once you start to look through that lens, you cannot unsee the injustice. And I think it's important that you label this problem about the lack of women at leadership level in teaching, and it isn't only teaching, obviously, and the sort of broader lack of diversity within that. I think we would like to be part of the solution, but it's an uncomfortable truth that it is injustice, and actually we all play our part in that, and we talk about that in the book, that actually we feel we're all charged with addressing that injustice.
Yeah. And I think, like, when you say that what you're brave enough to request, I know so many fantastic female teachers who would not be brave enough to. And obviously the hope is that the book gives them that courage, because I feel like a lot of female practitioners are more capable than they choose to be, or they don't put themselves forward for things that they don't think they'll be successful with, when I think they will.
Yeah, and the idea of being brave and courage comes out, by the way, in the case studies of the women that we interviewed. Very outwardly high-performing, successful power women that sort of were already in our network, that we admired, that we've worked with, or we've been inspired by. And this lack of courage ran through every single case study interview that we did. So it was a deliberate choice, really, to start with this idea that we've got to be brave to ask for this. And if we ask for it, we might just get it. But it starts with empowering people to, first of all, see that as theirs for the taking. And I think that's the other thing that we've tried to do in the book.
Definitely. I think it moves really well to the second question about the ripple effect that you speak about. So, and the idea that these ripples would disturb the specific pattern of patriarchal equilibrium. And I know we've spoken about it before, in the sense that it is a very systemic structural thing that's there, which has been there for many, many, many years. And when you think about lots of other things, I don't think actually men realise how ingrained it is. So when you talk about certain things, unless you, and like Chris has said, unless men are part of the conversation, they're never actually going to know the full extent of what women see as injustice. So therefore, if you don't know about it, how can you do anything about it? And you talk about this idea of throwing the pebble, so intentionally throwing your pebble. Now, one idea could be that you're the role model for the younger women in your place of work to step up and ask for that power being handed to you in some sense. But how else have you seen this ripple effect disturbing that equilibrium? Obviously your case studies, but anywhere else?
I would go to the Malala chapter for this, where we talk about, we use the quote from Malala that's like, one pen, one teacher, one lesson at a time can change the world. So for me, it's about those marginal gains, those very small daily, maybe even more frequently than daily, little tasks, little conversations, challenging something that's perhaps always been accepted. So for me, it's about that like piecemeal approach of actually one woman at a time. And, this idea of the ripple effect, you don't know how far a pebble's going to go. You don't know if you're going to cause a tsunami, because if everybody is throwing their pebble with the same intent to accomplish the same goal, that's got to pay off. I mean, we've seen that with 10% Braver. I mean, the indirect consequences of that book are huge. You still talk to people and they'll say, oh, I applied for this job off the back of somebody reading it or somebody telling me about it, or one chapter or one case study. And that's really what we've tried to harness, I suppose, in the book.
Yeah, and I would say that they don't need to be huge things that you do. I just think one thing I see often is very small things, are just saying positive things to people. If you've been in their assembly and you enjoyed it, and you take the time later that day to say, oh, I really enjoyed your assembly, I think you did well. But people don't realise what impact those kind remarks have on people's confidence, people's self-esteem, and hopefully getting them to feel like they're capable of even more than they're doing.
Yeah, and it still staggers me as I mentor early career teachers and I mentor aspiring leaders, and it still staggers me that very, very capable, successful women really do need talking into applying for promotion. So there's about 3 leaders in my school who really I did some work with about getting them to step up and put themselves out for, and I think every single one got the job. They were the front runner each time, but they perhaps their sense of self or the wider picture. So I think it's telling people, it could be as small as saying, have you seen this? Have you thought about this? Is this right for you? And again, thinking about early career teachers, seeing early career teachers as future leaders, female, and seeing leadership as almost as a natural continuation of what they do in the classroom. We talk about that, don't we, in one of the chapters? Yeah. Because the things that make teachers great are the same things that make leaders great. So for us, if you're a good teacher, it really is the sort of natural continuation.
Yeah, agreed.
I think what you touched on there is maybe a little bit of the imposter syndrome as well. If we go back to that equilibrium being that patriarchal structure, I suppose a lot of it might be that this imposter syndrome, in the sense that this is a man's space, leadership is a male space, and therefore how can I see myself in it? Or
and I think as a female leader, the thing that 10% Braver did for me is made me really aware that actually you've got to be part of a narrative. You've got to talk about the injustice. You've got to model the things that you want from other people. And I think you have to wear leadership lightly. You have to make it look joyful, because it is, and it's a privilege. But if I think back to earlier in my career, I didn't see the joy. I didn't see the privilege. I saw people very stressed, unpleasant sometimes to other people, and sometimes using the power perhaps not in the most compassionate or ethical way. And I think we can each do that, can't we, as players in our schools or in our networks or just in our communities, even just on Twitter. It's just about that narrative and showing actually that leadership is glorious and actually it's achievable for everybody.
Yeah, and I think on the imposter syndrome, I would add that since the people in headships and deputy headships are disproportionately male, I feel like naturally the message that people receive is that leaders look a certain way, and so then that's going to bias what they think they're capable of. So I think what we've tried to do with the book is show lots of strong female role models who may not be in teaching, but that you've still got those archetypes that you can be looking around for, and then you can then channel that as your own path, because you don't need to look the same as the leaders that you've seen before to still have an impact and still get the best of the students.
Brilliant. Yeah, and what's brilliant about your book is that idea of bringing it back to the why, bringing it back to the purpose. So the Nolan principles feature heavily in it because it's based around that. And the fact that it's a public funded profession where integrity should be at the heart, which again, there's so many quotes that I've highlighted because they're brilliant in the sense that it goes back to your why and this idea about social justice. And that's why we hope a lot of people come into the profession. And you've touched on that idea that leadership is not a destination. So it isn't that end point of getting to headship or whatever it is. It's a process. And I think the one thing that you've touched on there is that throughout your career, even in the classroom, you would be seen as a leader. And I suppose it's sort of renegotiating that narrative of what a leader is, and it's not about that end goal or that position. It's more about behaviours and traits, and like Chris has said, and then you'd be able to see those archetypes, those behaviours in different people. Mm-hmm. So we're going to go into the first archetype, which is Michelle Obama. And I've never met a woman who doesn't love Michelle Obama. Just for the sense that there's that openness. So that's the first principle that you talk about, the idea of openness, her being very much about addressing social injustice. And then the question came to mind was that obviously she, being a Black woman, having a lot of different types of, people weren't very nice to her for many reasons when she stepped up in that position that she had with Barack Obama. So if it's a struggle, you exercise integrity and authenticity. So in the sense that you need to have some sort of struggle in order to be able to lead in a way that will enable others.
See, with Michelle Obama, her struggle is just such a clear part of her narrative arc. And it does give her credibility, it does give her this authenticity, and it's very easy to see what she's about, and you can totally get why people are so inspired by her. But I wouldn't say that the struggle is, completely necessary in order to cultivate authenticity. So for me, authenticity is about being pupil-driven, it's about being ethical, and it's about being true to yourself. And we could all be true to ourselves. We go into a meeting and we put our personal agenda before the needs of others. That's not what I mean by being true to yourself. I don't mean serving yourself. I mean being devoted to the service. And Michelle Obama's really, she's a masterclass in servant leadership, which really, I suppose, aligns quite closely with the teaching profession, because it is all about serving other people. And I just love Michelle Obama, where she had that job at this law firm and she had this epiphany that actually this isn't success to me. And I think it's that more so than perhaps the struggle. It's that really characterises, I think, her leadership, this sort of signature move of, I'm going to absolutely turn my back on a lucrative career that I've worked for, and I'm going to serve people instead. She's just the OG. I absolutely love her.
Yeah. And I think you would find lots of males in leadership positions who've had no struggle, and it's just been very effortless, and it's been felt very logical for them to just get there. And I think,
linear.
Yeah, and I think while things are changing, there might be females who are having to overcome a struggle to do that, but I don't think that's normal. I don't think that's something that people want. But I do think it helps you to feel empathetic, when you're leading people who are going through something difficult. I think there are benefits, but I don't think it has to be there.
I don't think it has to be there, but I think if you can, I would seek to normalise the struggle.
Yeah.
Because who wants to be led by someone who's never encountered challenge, who's never encountered obstacles? I mean, we talk quite a lot when we've been speaking about the book about how we grew up, really, I suppose, in a low-income family, and how pupil premium didn't exist as a category then, but it would have been us. Yeah. That would have been us, and that brought us challenges, and I'm sure it's what brought us to teaching. But do you need to know that about me in order to be led by me? No. But can I use that to make me more empathetic? And I think as a leader, the closer, you need to just be close to the ground. You need to be close to why you're doing what you're doing. And sometimes in leadership, it feels really far removed. Like I'm an assistant head now, and I deal with fewer children than I ever have in my career, and I have to seek out opportunities to go and be with the students, because that's what I signed up for. And I think you have to just go back to that core purpose of why are we here? What's the job about? Is it about passing Ofsted? Is it about appeasing governors? Is it about this? No, it's about young people's life chances, and and making sure that we set up the next generation of young people to absolutely succeed, and removing those barriers as we go.
Absolutely. It's that idea though, isn't it? Unless you don't know what the barriers are, how are you able to remove them? So I think that's what she does really well, in the sense that she's exercising it because she knows what will happen if you remove those barriers for those people, and how people will blossom and flourish. But then my next question is, not all women are like that, and not all women are part of that solution. So there have been terms like the queen bee and things like that in schools, and I know that I've worked in, not where I am now or the trust that I'm with now, but there have been instances where you know who the queen bee is, and she's not necessarily a Michelle Obama. She's more like a mean girl. So in terms of
Sorry.
Oh, have we frozen?
Sorry.
Hello, are you there?
Yeah, we thought.
So if the universe is saying, don't ask this question, don't ask it, Karen. But not all women are part of the solution. So how do you navigate that? How do you navigate women who can see the barrier but aren't intentionally doing anything to remove it to serve?
Yeah, I think for me, leadership is about unity. And I would say it isn't just women, but I have worked with some women who aren't, on the Michelle Obama bus, and I can only hope that becomes, and labelled, and we've got a framework in which we can identify and address that as absolutely not being what leadership's about. I remember one female leader when I was pregnant with my son, pregnant for the first time, not an easy pregnancy at all, as you may remember. And I remember her saying to me, if you stop after this baby, they'll never feel bad if you go to a nativity for their child, because you need to think about this now. And with hindsight, that is illegal. That's not okay. So I can only hope, and the book is a deliberate attempt to renegotiate this leadership. And I think, we'll become the majority, this ethical, value-driven, and I think the MPQH now being aligned with the Nolan principles, I think is very helpful in sort of reframing this idea of leadership. And for me, if you're not uplifting other people, and you're just using leadership to make other people's jobs harder or more stressful in an already heavily, accountability-driven profession, I just don't think you should be doing it. But I don't know if that's a practical strategy.
No. I think maybe I'm misinterpreting what you mean, but I think some of the women that are coming to mind when you're saying that are people who feel like they lead despite being a woman, and they kind of have to suppress anything maternal or anything about being a woman that makes them a great leader. And I think what we've tried to get through the book is that lots of things about being a woman help you to be even stronger as a leader, and that you don't need to try and emulate what you think male leadership looks like, and then try and do something that's not natural and authentic to yourself. But then I would also say that these leaders that you're describing, you only see them for such a small glimpse of the day, and we'll talk a bit later on about batting away the criticism. And you don't know what their individual circumstances are like. There might be reasons for that. So I think it's nice to try and see both sides. Because you see one tiny glimpse of them in the day, and they probably think they're trying to do the best things.
They probably think that's what leadership is.
Yeah.
They probably have seen that, and I think representation is so important. And that's another part, I suppose, of the book. It's another layer, I think, that's at play in the book. It's just, if you see representation and you have it modelled to you, eventually that will become the exception rather than the norm.
Yeah,
is what I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think you touched that point about representation is a precursor to inclusivity. So it's that idea of the differences in people is something that should be nurtured. Right, moving on then to RuPaul. And this chapter is about honesty. And the one thing that I got from it more than anything was about this idea of delivering feedback, and it should be about serving others, even though sometimes it can be uncomfortable. If you're feeling uncomfortable and then choose not to do it, it's almost like you're serving your own needs before that person.
And
But what
hard.
RuPaul does,
That sounds easy, but it's actually really hard in the moment of a difficult conversation. I think it sounds easier than it is, but actually it does take some work, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
absolutely, and it's that idea of, it's not about shying away from the truth for a moment, because actually it's a moment of awkwardness and discomfort for you. However, it might do something in terms of longevity for that person that you're having to give that feedback to. And we briefly talked about this assertiveness spectrum, because RuPaul does come across as assertive, and when he gives feedback, it's very candid, and it's very valid in the sense that it's very factual. And I'll always go back to things like, if you're giving lesson feedback or appraisals or things like that, it's coming back to the teacher standards, coming back to something concrete, so that it's always valid and factual. And even though I think, Tracy, you said it sometimes feedback can come across as subjective, if the intention is there, then it will be done with the right intention, hopefully with the right outcome as well. But when it comes to women and assertiveness, there is that spectrum of how we're seen sometimes, and sometimes assertiveness can be perceived in a different way in a woman compared to a man.
I mean, assertiveness from a woman is 100% received differently to dealing with an assertive man, because if you're dealing with an assertive man, typically we hear about how powerful this man is or how competent this man is. And if you're dealing with an assertive woman, there's a whole different language that we attach to that. So it is problematic. And I think because it's problematic, RuPaul, I think, is the perfect queen for this chapter, because, you know, Ru obviously was not born a woman, but has this female persona that they put on. And we think that's really interesting about, assertive women generally.
Yeah, and that stepping into a woman's heels, as it was, makes him feel more confident, makes him feel like he can deliver this feedback that maybe he wouldn't do if, when he was a man. But yeah, I do think there's a point that there's certainly, I think there is a scale. I think some people, I don't think it's just female teachers, feel more comfortable or less comfortable being as honest as they need to be. But like you've said, keeping it with the students in mind, that teacher should get the same feedback to help them to improve or help the students to improve, regardless of the person delivering it. And if you have to kind of take yourself out of the situation for 10 minutes to channel the honesty and take yourself out of it completely, I think you just have to do it.
So in this chapter, we've got sentence stems for difficult conversations, and I really wish I'd had this earlier in my career, because it's a part of the job I really do not enjoy. It's not why I became a leader, was to have difficult conversations. And actually, if that is why I became a leader, I don't think this book is for you anyway.
I think it is especially for you.
Well, also that. But having worked with men in similar roles, I'm thinking like when I was a head of year, for example, I would go home and I would really think about difficult conversations, and I would replay them, and I would think, was I fair? Did I say the right thing? Have I upset them? And working with some of the men on the team, they did not go home and have the same emotional attachment or the same emotional response. And I can't say that that's definitely a woman thing, but we do know that women are ultimately more emotional than men, which is one of the things that I think makes them brilliant leaders. But 100% men do not go home and beat themselves up in the same way, from my experience. Do you want to tell me otherwise?
I think some men do,
okay.
But I think stereotypically perhaps. Yeah.
I think just speaking generally in my career, and hours and hours of like reflection and almost like trying to atone, like trying to think, have I done the right thing? And I just don't see that with men. And my husband's also a teacher, so he's kind of also my litmus test. So he doesn't come home and replay things in the same way that I don't do it anymore, but as I did earlier sort of in my career, going into leadership.
Yeah, and then like I said, you don't do it anymore. The more you do it, you kind of just have to get desensitized to it. The first times you have those conversations, they are horrendous and they don't feel comfortable, but you just have to do it, and then it becomes more normal, and then you deliver it better and more empathetically, I think, because you're not stressing about yourself and how you feel. Which I think you can at the start.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we're talking about with honesty is about, being accurate. So is there an issue with someone's teaching? What can be done about it? What's your evidence? And trying to have those difficult conversations, like armed. I don't want to use the word armed because it makes it sound more like
Going into battle. Yeah.
But having that information to make this honest conversation an accurate, evidence conversation, not a subjective response to something.
Yeah, and I think being armed is fine, especially when you're at the beginning of having these conversations, because when you're 5 years into it, you will be armed with all your experience anyway.
Yeah.
Whereas when you're doing it for the first time, consciously thinking about what things are likely to happen to make yourself feel comfortable, I think is sensible.
Yeah.
Because then you can afford to not think about yourself in the conversation, how awkward you feel, and you can just focus on delivering the feedback to help them if you've thought it through first.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that brings us really nicely onto the next chapter about Meghan Markle and this idea of objectivity. And it sort of touches on, so the question that I'll ask is, it sort of touches on what we've already spoken about in terms of that patriarchal space, that being the equilibrium, women not maybe feeling confident enough to go into it, and then some women sort of suppressing that side of them, that I don't know, nurturing side of them in leadership because they think otherwise they're not going to fit in that space. And then there's Meghan, who I've said it to you, is that she exemplifies that social dichotomy for women in the sense that you can be intelligent but you can't be intimidating, beautiful but not glamorous, vulnerable but not weak. And then you can see these traits in her right from the off, and it's probably why Prince Harry married her. So she's ambitious, driven, determined, assertive, direct. And it's not about, and she is a trailblazing leader in that sense, in the sense that she doesn't necessarily find her validity or needing to be liked, I suppose. It's that self-awareness that she's obviously nurtured. How does that translate to maybe, say, early career teachers who they want to be seen credible, they want to be seen good at their job, but then it's that idea of approval, isn't it? That you want to find your sense of self, but then you're still needing that sense of approval as well from the people above you. So how do you channel Meghan Markle in that sense of being ambitious? Yeah, being ambitious and driven, but then not to the point where you put people off.
Heaven forbid you should intimidate someone with your own brilliance. So we talk about Meghan in the sense that kind of the issue with Meghan is that she shone a bit too brightly for some quarters, and actually we're comfortable to some extent with that, but actually in the context of the British monarchy, which is, you know, hierarchical by nature, that is problematic. And we're saying actually that's the opposite of what we're saying in the book. We're saying shine that light, don't dim that light because other people find it a little bit intimidating. So part of this chapter was about really labeling that for what it was, and we knew that including Meghan was going to be divisive because she is divisive. She does polarize opinion. And in writing the book, you'd have a conversation with somebody and they'd say, oh, I'm not reading it if Meghan Markle's in it. And you'd say, actually, you really need to read this then because where's that coming from? What is this specific problem? So I understand people don't like that Harry's in America and blah, blah, blah. But that isn't really what I think gets people's goat about Meghan. I think it's that she presents as so competent. She presents as almost flawless. And then when she talks about being vulnerable, people perceive it as insincere, because how can you as a woman be so outwardly capable and confident and brilliant, and then how dare you articulate that doesn't come as easily as it looks? So for me, Meghan is fascinating. But in terms of courting approval, Christopher, you were saying before.
Yeah, I was saying, especially as an early careers teacher, I think you can mistake approval and being liked. So I know certainly when I started teaching, I wanted my classes to like me because I was new and I thought that was a metric of doing well at my job, and it's not the same. And I think that approval comes from, you know, their success and from your line manager hopefully telling you that you're doing a good job. But I think sometimes people mistake approval for being liked, and you can be a popular colleague and be terrible at your job, but be going around.
But you're a right laugh.
Yeah, but thinking that you're amazing, and it's not the same thing.
And I think we talk about metric a lot, really, because I think as a profession we are starved of praise to the extent where it can be difficult to know on a day-to-day basis. And I would say as a leader, it's hard to know, am I doing it right? So I think we offer these alternative metrics, and that's really what we mean by objectivity. So how can you quantify what you are doing, and how do you know you're doing the right thing on a day-to-day basis? And the thing we keep coming back to in the book, and we've already spoken about, is why are we in a school? What brought us to the profession? It's about children, it's about their life chances, it's about empowering, uplifting, it's about that person that would never have gone to university were it not for you. And I think, as Christopher says, that isn't the same as being popular. But I think in the absence of a more meaningful metric, that's as an ECT, that is your litmus test of, well, my classes like me. Yeah, but your classes might like you if you have low standards. They'll be thrilled to walk into your classroom. So we're talking about respect, we're talking about self-respect, we're talking about self-preservation, which I think Megan, regardless of your opinion on her, offers us a very clear way in which that can be executed. And I think the specific thing we talk about is, she asked for things that nobody dared to ask. And even if we don't like that because Harry's in America and we don't have him all to ourselves and we love him and he's our favourite prince and all of that, that is bold, that is admirable. And that to me makes her this trailblazer. But I know people have very strong feelings on it.
Yeah, and one of the things I was inspired by, like you said before, you'd go home and having had a conversation and dwell on it. I think Meghan Markle received so much criticism, rightly or wrongly, depending on what you think, but I would hope that she doesn't appear to dwell on it. She doesn't seem to let that bother her.
She's not defined by it, is what I really like.
Which I think is something that all teachers can take. A child says something annoying to you in a day, and you can go home and dwell on it all night and not sleep properly and then go to school the next day haggard because you've not slept and then it will affect you. Or you can be like, no, that was the end of the day, it's done with, I'm moving on. And I think
it's this thick skin.
What I like
it's this thick skin. And if you haven't got the thick skin, fake it until you make it.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about with Meghan.
Yeah, I think you've
on the record, I love the woman. Sorry, everybody.
I adore her. I think she's amazing. But I think it's really interesting what you say about the idea that she shines too brightly for some people, not all people. I think that depending on how you perceive her, she either shines in the right way for you or she blinds you. But it's that idea of
patriarchy, isn't it? That is absolutely a patriarchal lens that we want women to succeed, but don't succeed so much.
Too much, yeah.
Don't be the person who opens the Pandora box and shows the Wizard of Oz for who he is. Goodness, what would happen to the world if you did that? Society would crumble. I mean, geez, and that's what I love. I'm all for opening that box.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, I think it's that idea as well. When I think of Meghan, that she'll make certain people feel uncomfortable because she highlights something, the way that I perceive the reaction towards her, that it's something that they don't like about themselves. And I think what she does really well is she channels that self-awareness for herself. And I just wish more people would do that for themselves. We probably wouldn't have this negative rhetoric around her. But it is that idea when you go back to patriarchy, especially with women, it's because when you think about patriarchy, it's founded on women competing against each other because they couldn't get anything unless they were married to someone. They couldn't find a house, couldn't get a job, everything else. So it's when you think about certain structures like that being ingrained, and you have someone like Meghan who's very competent, who seems very much about being self-aware to the point where she's not governed by criticism, it can make people uncomfortable because they can't control her. She's not in that system to be controlled. She's almost shattering it from within.
Yeah, and I think it's that makes her so interesting, really, to deconstruct. So I'm all for having an intelligent, informed conversation about Meghan Markle and why we feel a certain way. But I would say over the last sort of 2 years I've been working on the book, they are not the conversations that have come my way. I have just had, there's something about her.
Yeah, people can't articulate what they don't like, and I'm like, well, like them then. There's no reason not to.
Yeah, but we don't say that about men, do we? We don't say, there's just something about him. Oh, there's just something about the way we don't feel that way. The men don't elicit the same response as somebody like Meghan. So, Steve Markle.
Absolutely. Right, let's move on then to this idea of. Don't think we need to actually. We'll move on to Lady Gaga and this idea of being selfless. Her idea of being selflessness being a channel of that. So again, Lady Gaga, we can absolutely say isn't controlled by outside opinion, and she's paved a legacy already which is unreal in the way that she enables people to just be themselves. Who they are is enough, and you should just be that. Born This Way, so the kindness and the youth work that she's doing with mental health as well is amazing. How, though, can you be... Because when you think about being selfless, it's that idea of less, isn't it? Less of yourself. How can you be selfless but still have well-being as a form of discipline for you? Because I think, especially with teaching, you give and you give and you give so much, because that is part of the job. So how do you then, in turn, because she's a good role model in many ways, but how do you find well-being as a form of discipline for yourself?
Well, if I link that to what I was saying before with the comment from a student, and you dwell on it all night, you know, that if your evening is solely monopolised by work or a comment that's gone through your head or whatever, I just genuinely don't think that you can go into school the next day and do the job justice, because you'll be tired, you'll be more emotional. You just can't give the students what they need if you haven't taken care of yourself first, because you're more likely to snap at them, you're more likely to make an irrational decision. And I just don't think on any level students get the best from you if you have run yourself into the ground because you think you're doing all the right things by staying up till midnight marking. And the students do not care. Like, the students would rather you turn up the next day fresh faced with energy and a sense of humour and teaching them well. And if you say, sorry, I didn't have a chance to write your books, I think they would much rather that and your work-life balance be intact. Because I see so many people run ragged, and for the right reasons, because they're trying to serve the students and put their needs first. But I genuinely don't think it is at all possible if you do not keep yourself sane at the same time.
Yeah, and I think there's a difference between selfless as a leader and being a martyr. So we're not saying as a leader go round and offer to cover everybody a day just to give some capacity to your team, because that is not a framework that is going to help well-being. That's a short-term measure that will wear off after that day, and then you'll be completely depleted. So I think we're talking about really trying to approach the job with well-being in mind, and I think the new Ofsted framework is very helpful, I think, in making schools accountable for well-being. And I have to say, it's about time. 15 years ago when I joined the profession, it was just expected. We had an Ofsted, back in the days when you'd get the call before, weekend before, it was like an unofficial mandate that you're all in for 2 days, and then you turn up on the day, you're absolutely shattered, and you've taken 5 hours to do something that could have taken you 30 minutes, but you've allocated your time accordingly. So I think in terms of well-being, the profession needs a much more systemic response to that. But we're talking about, as leaders, what can you do? When we talk about well-being, we talk about, don't live off caffeine and sugar, because that might get you through one half term, but that isn't going to set you up for a long career in the profession and your sort of longevity and stamina. And finding, I think the thing about well-being is, for me as a leader, if the work is important and if it needs to be done and it's going to have an impact, let's give it the time. If there isn't a purpose, if it isn't going to make students' lives better or radically have an impact, do we need to do it? Do we need to do 7 initiatives, or can we focus on one? And I would say, as a leader, the more senior you get, the more you perhaps are in a position to influence that in a way that as an ECT you might not. So I suppose the thing I'd want from ECTs to get from this chapter is this idea that your well-being isn't like a bonus. It's something that as a profession you're entitled to. And if there is something which is impacting your well-being, then let's channel Megan and communicate that in an objective way with perhaps some evidence, being honest like Rue, or we could link them all. But, really feeling that actually your well-being, it's in everybody's interest. We all know about the retention issue in teaching, and that on top of the recruitment issue, so even those we manage to recruit don't want to stay. We all know about the specific impact it has on women and those years in which they're statistically most likely to leave the profession. So it's more about longevity and stamina for me.
Yeah, and I think creating a culture where well-being is valued. Like we're at the minute, we've got game time at school because all the students are just left, the 11s and 13s, and we are proactively trying to do things that will make people's lives easier for the following year, because the team that we have cares about well-being and wants doesn't want a spiral where things just get harder and harder and harder. We want to be creating systems where our lives get easier and easier and easier. And if I think back to when I was an EC, well, it was an NQT at that point, but I used to work every night and all day Sunday, and the only time I'd give myself was like a few hours on Saturday. I just don't know how I did it. So if that's the norm when you first go into it, when you're your least experienced, then it needs to change. And I think it is changing.
I think it is changing. I don't know if it's changing as quickly as we need it, but we talk about Lady Gaga gives this quote about discipline, and actually well-being is a discipline. It's so much easier to just survive. It's so much easier to just work till midnight, because actually in teaching, it's Mary Poppins' bag. It will fit as much in as you've got, but that doesn't mean it all has to be done at the same time. So I think there's lots of things that you can do, but the selfless thing is to put aside your ego, put aside your agenda, and really serve the students. And I would say that's no different to the other chapters.
No, agreed.
Incidentally, by the way, we didn't talk much about imposter syndrome in the book, but as part of the research we watched quite a lot of documentaries, watched quite a lot of TED Talks, a lot of interviews, read a lot of books, and Lady Gaga's initial incarnation, her initial sort of caricature, I think it was imposter syndrome in action. And she said something like, if they wanted me to go and be this like product, I was going to make it as ridiculous as possible, to make it as far removed from myself as possible. So even though we're not advocating turn up in a meat dress, this idea of having a persona where there's a little bit of a buffer between the real you and the outwardly facing professional who's in front of students every day, I think that's really important with well-being and longevity and self-preservation as well. Yeah. And I think you could also link that to Rue, couldn't you?
I was going to say that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And in that chapter as well, you talk, so every chapter is a case study as well about a real life, well, they're all real life queens, but real life in terms of education. And the one about pupil premium and this person-centered approach about addressing the endemic, systemic, generational issue, it really hit home in the sense that, I was a pupil premium child, really, when I think about it. Yeah. It's probably a lot of us in this profession, isn't there?
I bet there is.
But it's that idea of, can you touch a bit more on that case study? And because the fact that it's pupil premium, that's a barrier in itself. And then when you think about SENDA and all of the other things as well, but pupil premium seems to be one that is now being taken a lot more seriously, because even though it's not seen as such, it does have a massive impact on a child's life chance. So can you talk a bit more about that case study and how this lady sort of exemplified Lady Gaga's idea of selflessness?
Yeah, so the selflessness really that you see in this case study, and it isn't the only case study where this is true, but this is the one specifically about pupil premium, is about seeing those students as individuals and not as this demographic, and not using this as a reason why we're going to continue to underachieve. And this person-centered approach was about really meeting with individual students and looking for common themes and barriers, rather than coming at it from a place of assumption or presumption or prejudice, because without evidence, it's prejudice. So the teacher in question, Mrs. W, met with these students and learned that actually some of the things that were barriers weren't sort of traditional academic barriers. They were things like they'd never eaten in a restaurant, or they've never learned to swim. So there was this real 360 approach. And so one strand was to put some of those things into place, and the other strand was about a careers programme that upskilled those students and gave them this sort of extra layer of intervention, this extra layer of preparation for the real world. But the truly selfless part about that was that this programme didn't directly contribute to the school's impact measures. It didn't have a direct correlation with outcomes or progress aid or basics measure. But what it did do on a meaningful level was equip those children as individuals with things that they'd been missing. And the reason they had been missing them was a direct result of disadvantage, because that's what it is. When you've got parents who are either willing or can afford to take you to swimming lessons, and you've got parents who haven't, that's not on you as a child. You didn't ask for that as a card to be dealt. So So that was this idea of selflessness. And the thing I take from that is just treating these children as individuals, but even within that cohort, there were common themes, and putting resource in and putting, you know, staff time into a course that does not make a jot of difference to the school's impact measure, I think is very selfless. You know, on a like a systematic, strategic level. But there's no doubt that will have paid off. It's just that the metric for it will look different. So I think those students, a lot of them went on to appropriate level 3 courses, and they went on to succeed. And maybe it wasn't this career program that they did. Maybe it was somebody sitting them down and having a conversation with them and seeing them as an individual, even though they are part of a wider demographic. So that I enjoyed that case study, but I just really like this idea of we can do things for children that don't benefit the school, because that's what we should be about as teachers. It is not just about chasing the headline data.
Brilliant, thank you. Now, if people don't want to read the book after that, I'm not entirely sure what
I mean, come on, everybody.
I know. Now, the theme that tends to run through this, my perception again, but is this idea across all of the chapters so far, was that, yeah, it's not about courting the approval of others. It doesn't matter if you're not liked. It's about acting on integrity, and therefore you're more likely to be respected for the choices that you're making. And I definitely think, from what I've read so far, that comes across with every single queen that we've touched on. Sure. We're going to move on to the idea of integrity, and Jacinda Ardern. I think I couldn't think of a better queen myself, to be fair. Very humane, very person-centered, and her strength does come from kindness. When you think about the way that she, with everything that she does, she is a kind leader through and through. But that doesn't mean that she's a people pleaser, which I think, again, kindness can sometimes be misconstrued as you're wanting people to like you and to please them. When, I don't know if you've come across radical candor, but it's that idea sometimes to be kind, you have to be concise and clear, not necessarily cruel, but it's that idea of being clear with someone is just as important as them, you know, as the the stuff with kindness. She definitely selfless humility, and that lens of compassion, and that idea, and we've spoke about it already, especially with the people premium, that children are not statistics. It's about their life chance, and they shouldn't be defined by the demographic. And this idea that you can disagree without demonizing as well, which I think she does really, really well. How, again, would you see that channeled into school context with, I don't know, like maybe like middle leader by this point, but still a teacher? She's got teams disagreeing with her about something that she's put in place. How would you use Jacinda Ardern to sort of navigate through that situation? How would she become your archetype?
Well, the first thing to say is we love Jacinda Ardern. I love Jacinda Ardern almost a weird amount. So I'm just going to put that out now. So you don't expect like a measured, objective answer to this. And Vivian Porritt wrote the foreword, as you will know, to this, and she said something like she's a human first and a leader second. And I think that's what you have to keep hold of in the profession, because some of the processes, particularly at middle leadership, some of the conversations that you need to have, you could forget that you're talking about children. You could forget, you could be thinking that you're talking about, I don't know, a sales target, and not individual children and individual teachers with, you know, unique circumstances and pressures and mental health and their own well-being. So for me, Jacinda Ardern is very strong, and I would use that definitely. I'd have that in my artillery as a leader. She doesn't strike me as somebody who would ever say anything negative for the sake of saying something negative. I would imagine if you're saying something negative, there's a clear purpose behind it. So I think that's an important distinction that you can make as a middle leader. And I just think about this humane angle, like the things that she has done as a leader, where, you know, she made the other MPs take a pay cut in solidarity when the pandemic hit. I mean, is that really radical? Is it really radical to hold yourself to the same account that you expect of others? And it's sad, really, that it's perceived as radical, because actually it's common sense. That's what good people do with integrity. So I think it's this idea of you're never too important to do what you ask of others. You're never too important to be nice to people. And this idea of disagreeing without demonizing. If you've got evidence and you've got reasons for what you're disagreeing about, but I think you've also got to be open to hearing the other ideas, which I suppose is another draw on Michelle Obama's chapter. This idea that actually it can be really helpful sometimes disagreeing, because it's a public funded job, and at certain levels you get public money to distribute. Thinking about the pupil premium that schools receive, that's not certainly in my school, that's not a small amount of money. And if you can't be challenged on that, or if you don't hold up to scrutiny, that's a problem. So I think it's about just putting the students' needs back at the centre, putting the pupils' needs back at the centre, but having integrity enough to know that if somebody comes and questions you, that there's no dark secret to find. And actually, if you were wrong about something, you'd say, oh right, okay, I'm really interested to hear that. Should we have a conversation about it?
Yeah. And
that actually, we need to move away from this narrative that leaders are doing something other than serving the children. That this idea that classroom teachers serve the children and leaders do something else, because actually we should all be doing the same thing.
Yeah, and one of the threads that I hope came through the book is that teaching and leading are virtually the same thing. So I think from a student perspective, we make a distinction between the student themselves and their behaviour. And I think the quote that you brought out is the same with staff. If a member of staff says something that I don't agree with or I disagree with, it's that particular phrase, that particular thing they're instigating that I don't like. It's not the person. And I think it's keeping the two things separate, because we do it automatically with students because we're adults and we have to. And again, it's that idea of when you're leading people, you can still make that distinction between the behaviour. I know it's not the same as swearing in a classroom or whatever, but the thing they've said or done that's maybe you didn't like, and the individual that said it.
And you can still have a very difficult conversation in the context of a meeting and walk out and wish them a nice weekend, because I think that's what Jacinda Ardern would do, 100%. And we talk about politics and about being the bigger person, and we talk about how Jacinda Ardern, it's a different sort of politics. And you get politics in school, and we talk about making a mistake, and in school, what if Jacinda Ardern used your mug? What would she do? We should probably buy you a new one with a teapot and a year's supply of tea and coffee, because she's the bigger person. And I think that's what comes across with her all the time, is she comes from a place of integrity, and she doesn't do anything or model any behaviour that contradicts what she's outwardly saying, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
I just love her. Do you think she'd like me to watch this and want to make friends?
I hope so, yeah. Hope so.
Well,
yeah. Yeah, I definitely think she's comes from a place of compassion, but it's the idea that do as I do, not do as I say, sort of thing. She's very much a role model. She leads by example. I think that's what comes across.
So much more concisely.
There was a lot of passion in what you were saying, which was beautiful. That's how it should be. We're coming to the end now, so we've only got 5 minutes left. So I'm going to sort of put you both on the spot. But is there a chapter in particular that you really enjoyed writing about, other than Jacinda Ardern, Tracy, and Megan? Are there any other chapters? Because I really want to read the rest of the book. I will find time to read the rest of it.
Well, it's interesting that we haven't spoken about Kim Kardashian, because she is probably the wildest.
She's the one who made me a bit, really.
And isn't that interesting? So I delivered on this at a university this week. I talked about Nolan principles, and I said, just for fun, who would you attribute with these different leadership behaviours? So I went for accountability, and it was so interesting what people said. So for me, the less typical a leader the woman was, the more interesting it was to write. So RuPaul, interesting because she is not who you think of when you think of leadership. And similarly for Kim Kardashian. So for anybody out there who doubts the intentions behind the Kim Kardashian chapter, she is about having absolutely outrageous goals, communicating them, manifesting them, and then finding a metric in order to prove what you've done. And we look at alternative metric to student outcomes, because that's the obvious thing that people will go to in the profession. So for me, she was really interesting. It's one of the first ones that was written. I think she was written after Megan, and then it got like more conventional. And the more conventional they were to write, the less fun I would say. Well, Lady Gaga was good as well.
Yeah, my favourite ones were Kim Kardashian and RuPaul. But I am not a huge fan of Kim Kardashian. But in writing it, I was kind of modelling what I hope other people were doing. That even if it's not something I'm a huge fan of, the things I'm writing, I'm like, oh, I can see how this person does this, and I can see how I could channel something of theirs in teaching, even if I've got my own personal opinions on them. I mean, I don't dislike her, but you love her.
I wouldn't say love. I'd say I admire what she's accomplished, and I can separate that from any other things that people think about Kim Kardashian. But having outrageous goals, like when she came out and she was like, I want to be on Vogue, and people just like laughed at her. Well, there's a bit of that. There's a bit of going into profession and saying I want to be a head teacher, and people going, oh, okay, get back to me in 5 years, darling. Actually, that happens all the time. So the other thing we talk about with Kim is narrative, is about controlling narrative, which obviously she does in a literal sense as an executive producer of her own reality show, which shows a curated version of her. And we talk about using that, building a professional brand, and curating your own career in the same way. So I stand by Kim.
Agree.
Well, I think I'm intrigued now to read that one. Chris and Tracy, it was brilliant speaking to you. Thank you so much. And if anyone hasn't yet, unless I haven't bought it for you already, like I definitely think it's one of those that you should. I'm going to use the word. It should be in your arsenal, especially for a driven, ambitious young. I really wish I had this when I was starting out in teaching. So I think it's like you say, there's certain sentence stems, there's certain pieces of like nuggets of gold that come with experience. But I think it's that idea of sharing, and that's a ripple in itself by sharing what you've learned with somebody else. So thank you so much.
No, thank you.
Thank you for having us. Thank you for such insightful questions, because when we got the notes, we were like, is this really as good? It sounds so good in these notes. Is this what we said? So it really made us think, and just a massive thank you to the Women Ed community, without whom I'm about 70% certain we would never have been published, because I'm sure it was the support that was offered from the off, ostensibly by Vivian in offering to write the foreword. I've no doubt that was a really important reason why we were taken seriously when we shopped this around to Routledge, a very serious academic publisher, who were like horrified at the idea of including a book about Kim Kardashian, but came round to our way of thinking. And I really would credit Women Ed 10% braver for starting us on this path, and Vivian in particular for helping us bring it to life. So it's a very sincere and heartfelt thank you, and I really hope we get to work together or do something again, because it's just such important work.
Definitely, and that's a perfect end there. So thank you very much. Bye everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.